A mother, still reeling from the unimaginable loss of her son and the father of her child, was gunned down in a brutal attack that would leave the community in shock. 2 months after burying her son Malik, and just 6 months after losing Jamal, the father of her child, Shante Williams was shot 69 times. 46 bullets struck her in a terrifying barrage that left little chance for survival. The cold, calculated nature of the crime left detectives stunned. Was this a revenge killing, someone finally taking justice into their own hands for the wrongs of the past? Or was there something more to it? Something no one expected? In the days following her death, the questions only multiplied. Who would want to silence a grieving mother, someone already consumed by tragedy? The brutality of it all raised even more questions. Could it have been a random act of violence? Or was there something more personal behind it? Shante Williams had already faced more hardship than most could bear. Her son, Malik, had died in a hit-and-run accident just a week earlier. Jamal, her partner and the father of her child, had been gunned down 6 months before. Left with nothing but a broken heart and a young daughter to care for, Shante's world was already shattered. She had been trying to rebuild, to move forward, but her past, her connections, the people who once shared her life, seemed unwilling to let her go. Was it these connections, the ghosts of Jamal's past, that finally caught up with her? Detective Carl Edwards was the man assigned to Shante's case, and from the moment he arrived at the scene of her murder, he knew this wasn't just another case. The execution-style brutality of the killing, the sheer number of shots fired, told him that this wasn't random. This was personal. But who had the motive to carry out such an attack? Some of the first clues pointed toward Jamal's past, a past full of gang associations and enemies, but it didn't take long for the case to take a shocking turn. Shante had been a mother trying to escape that life. She had been trying to keep her daughter safe, away from the influence that had taken her partner's life. She had cut ties with those who once held power over her. But someone was still watching. Someone knew where she lived, knew her routines, and knew how to find her. The deeper the investigation went, the more complicated the truth became. Detectives uncovered that Shante had been receiving threats in the months leading up to her death. Messages warning her to stop asking questions, to stop digging into the past. But who was sending these threats? And why did they suddenly escalate to murder? The first witness to come forward was a neighbor who claimed to have heard the gunshots. At first, he thought it was a car backfiring, something common in the area. But the sound that followed was unmistakable. Gunfire. He rushed to his window and saw a dark-colored sedan speeding away. But in the panic of the moment, he couldn't identify the driver. The police found nothing significant about the vehicle. The next lead came from a close friend of Shante's, someone who had known her for years. She said that Shante had been talking to someone in the weeks before her death, someone from Jamal's past, someone with a reputation for violence. Could this be the person responsible for her murder? As the investigation continued, new details emerged. The autopsy revealed more disturbing facts. The bullets that killed Shante didn't come from one gun, but 2. Different calibers, different weapons. Who else could have been involved in the shooting? Could this have been a professional hit, or was it something else entirely? Detective Edwards found himself piecing together a puzzle that seemed to have no clear solution. Then came the breakthrough. Surveillance footage from a nearby store captured a figure walking toward Shante's car just minutes before the shooting. The figure was wearing a hoodie and a baseball cap, obscuring their face, but they were carrying something. The footage was grainy, but there was no mistaking the urgency of their movements. And when the camera caught the person turning back toward the car, it became clear, they weren't just looking for a confrontation, they were preparing for it. This wasn't a random act. This was a calculated, targeted attack. It wasn't long before Detective Edwards found the connection. The person in the footage was none other than Tyrone Johnson, an old associate of Jamal's from his gang days. Tyrone had been out of prison for a few months now and was known for his violent tendencies. Was he acting alone? Or was someone else pulling the strings? The deeper Edwards dug, the more tangled the case became. Tyrone had an alibi, or at least he claimed he did, but something didn't sit right. He had been involved in a shooting just weeks before Shante's murder, and when police questioned him about his whereabouts that night, his answers were vague. He denied knowing Shante, denied having any reason to kill her. But what if Tyrone wasn't the real killer? What if he had been set up to take the fall? New evidence pointed to another startling possibility. Shante had been carrying a gun in her car the night she was murdered. Why would she be armed? Was she afraid of something? The discovery of the gun suggested that Shante may have known her life was in danger. Was she expecting a confrontation, or was she simply trying to protect herself in a world that had already taken so much from her? But just when Detective Edwards thought he had it figured out, another twist changed everything. Tyrone's alibi was confirmed. It wasn't him who had pulled the trigger. It wasn't even his gun. The case suddenly became more complex than anyone had imagined. As the investigation continued, the truth behind Shante's murder slowly began to unravel. There were connections to a larger network of people, including Jamal's old enemies. The possibility of a gang war being reignited, of old grudges being paid back in blood, seemed increasingly likely. But there was still one missing piece of the puzzle, one question that no one could answer. If Tyrone wasn't the one responsible for Shante's death, then who was? The investigation into Shante's murder continued for months, and while the police were able to arrest several people connected to her past, they never found the person truly responsible. But her story, her tragic end, left a mark on everyone who heard it. What really happened that night? What caused someone to take a life so brutally, especially when that life had already been shattered by so much loss? And as the investigation continued, one thing became clear: the story of Shante Williams was far from over. The final chapter had yet to be written, and the truth, still elusive, would continue to haunt those who were left behind. As the days turned into weeks, the case of Shante Williams continued to simmer in the background of the investigation. The more Detective Carl Edwards pieced together, the more it seemed as though every lead was just another dead end. Tyrone Johnson had been cleared, his alibi confirmed, but his involvement in the murder still weighed heavily on Edwards' mind. There was no question that he had been part of Shante's world, but did that mean he was the one who killed her? Something about the entire situation didn't add up. With the breakthrough in surveillance footage, there were no more answers, just more questions. The figure in the hoodie, the person who had approached Shante's car, was still an enigma. They were wearing a baggy hoodie and a baseball cap, which made identification impossible. But there was a moment in the video, a split second, when the camera caught a glimpse of something important. A tattoo on the person's wrist. It was faint, but visible enough to be recognized. A symbol from Jamal's past, a mark from a group of people who had once ruled the streets around Detroit. A gang that had long been thought to have disbanded. Edwards knew that this discovery opened a new door. The tattoo, a symbol of loyalty to Jamal's old crew, meant that whoever killed Shante wasn't just an enemy from the past, they were someone who had been tied to her partner's criminal life. Someone with a deep-seated grudge. But that didn't explain why they had turned their anger toward Shante, who had no connection to the violence of Jamal's past. She had spent the last months of her life trying to distance herself from the chaos that had claimed her family. So why target her now? What had she done to provoke such a brutal attack? As Edwards went through Shante's phone records, he uncovered a string of messages from an unknown number. The messages were cryptic but pointed, threats directed at Shante, warnings that her life was in danger if she continued asking too many questions. But who was sending them? And what questions had Shante been asking that led to her death? The threats had come in waves, starting soon after Malik's tragic death. It seemed that the more Shante tried to move on, the more determined someone was to remind her of the past she had tried to leave behind. But there was a peculiar detail in one of the messages that stood out. It wasn't a threat at all. It was a plea for forgiveness. Someone had written to Shante, apologizing for their involvement in Jamal's death, asking her to let go of the past. Whoever this was, they seemed to know far too much about her life. But Shante had never responded to the message. The silence between them was deafening. What was she hiding? What had she learned that was worth killing her over? There was also the matter of the gun found in Shante's car. Why had she been armed? Had she been expecting someone to come for her? Edwards couldn't help but wonder if Shante knew something that made her a target. Had she been aware of the impending danger? Or was it simply her way of protecting herself in a world that had already betrayed her? A key witness finally came forward, a former associate of Jamal's who had spent time in prison with Tyrone. This man, who had agreed to speak only under anonymity, claimed that there was a price on Shante's head. According to him, Jamal's old enemies were furious that she had tried to move on, to sever ties with the underworld that had so deeply entangled her life. It seemed that Shante's desire to escape had been seen as an act of betrayal, a rejection of the loyalty she had once shared with Jamal's crew. But even as these new revelations came to light, Edwards found himself caught in a moral dilemma. Was this just a revenge killing for Jamal's death, or had Shante become an unintended victim of a much larger game? And what about the people who had once been close to her? Was someone in her inner circle involved? Was there someone else who had a reason to silence her? The investigation began to take a more personal turn. Edwards interviewed people who had been close to Shante in the months leading up to her death, hoping to uncover some small detail that would lead him to the killer. It wasn't long before a chilling possibility emerged. One of Shante's closest friends, someone she had trusted with her secrets, had been acting suspiciously ever since the murder. This friend had been present during many of the conversations about Shante's troubled past, and had even been among those who knew about the threats she'd been receiving. Could it be that someone so close to Shante was behind the murder? Did they know something more than they let on? A breakthrough came when Edwards uncovered another layer of Shante's life. A hidden relationship, one that had remained secret from her family and friends. She had been seeing someone new, someone who, at first glance, seemed to be the very opposite of the violence that had dominated her past. This man, Derek, was quiet, unassuming, and had no apparent ties to Jamal's old life. But when Edwards dug into his background, he discovered that Derek had once been a part of Jamal's circle. He had been there, in the shadows, when Jamal's enemies came for him. Could it be that Derek had been the one to pull the trigger, or was he being manipulated by someone else? As Edwards tracked down Derek, he learned that the man had been in contact with Shante just hours before her death. They had spoken about a future together, about starting fresh away from the chaos of their past. But Derek's alibi was shaky, and as the pieces of his story began to crumble, Edwards couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Derek had something to hide. But Derek wasn't the only suspect. As Edwards uncovered more about Shante's past, more potential motives began to surface. There were others who had reasons to hate Shante, to fear her. One of them was a former associate of Jamal's named Marcus, who had once tried to force Shante into joining his drug business. When she refused, he had become furious. Could Marcus have been behind the murder, avenging his bruised ego? As more details came to light, Detective Edwards grew more certain of one thing: someone close to Shante had orchestrated her death. Whether it was a former lover, a vengeful enemy, or a person driven by greed, the truth was slowly revealing itself. The case, which had seemed like a random act of violence, was now a carefully planned execution. Shante had been caught in a web of betrayal, violence, and unresolved vendettas, many of which had nothing to do with her at all. Her death was a message, but the message was still unclear. As Edwards closed in on the final pieces of the puzzle, the most unsettling question remained: who would kill a mother already mourning so many losses? And, in the end, would justice ever truly be served? The investigation into Shante Williams' murder would continue for months, but as time went on, the answers seemed to slip further away, like sand through the fingers. Her family, left in mourning, could only wait. And for those who had known her, the chilling reality set in: the truth might never come. Detective Edwards knew that time was running out. The more time passed, the colder the case became, but the puzzle pieces kept showing up, slipping into place one by one, like the slow click of a clock ticking toward an inevitable conclusion. Yet even as new evidence emerged, it only served to deepen the mystery surrounding Shante Williams' death. And in the shadows of the investigation, other questions, more chilling and even more personal, loomed. It became evident that the people closest to Shante weren't the only ones hiding something. Edwards uncovered a startling new lead when a witness came forward, claiming to have seen a vehicle outside Shante's apartment complex the night before the murder. It wasn't a random car, it had been there multiple nights. And its license plate number had been flagged as stolen, a stolen car that had been used in previous crimes tied to the gang that once ruled Detroit streets. The stolen car, a nondescript black SUV, had been seen driving past Shante's apartment, often circling the block just after dark. Was it watching her? Was it the same vehicle that had been caught speeding away from the scene of her murder? Could this vehicle be a key to uncovering the identity of the killer? With this new information, Edwards turned his attention to a man named Curtis Jackson, a known figure in the criminal underworld who had been involved with the gang Jamal used to run with. Curtis was known for his connections to organized crime, but more troublingly, he was known for his ruthlessness. No one dared cross him, and his rise in the underworld had come with a trail of bloodshed. According to police records, Curtis had been in jail on multiple occasions, but it was his connections to Shante's former partner, Jamal, that seemed to tie him to the case. Jamal had owed Curtis money, debts that had gone unpaid for years. Was it possible that Shante's murder was simply the final payment on those debts, an act of vengeance for something Jamal had done? Or was Curtis involved in something even darker? The more Edwards dug, the more connections appeared. Curtis had been seen in the same circles as Tyrone Johnson, the former associate of Jamal's who had been questioned earlier in the case. He had also been known to have frequent meetings with Marcus, the man Shante had once rejected when he tried to bring her into his drug business. These overlapping connections were no coincidence. It was clear that Shante's death was the result of something much larger than a simple revenge killing or a dispute over money. It was the final, brutal consequence of a web of entanglements too complicated to understand in its entirety, yet it all led back to the same place. Shante Williams, a woman already carrying the weight of unimaginable grief, had been an unwitting player in this world of organized crime, violence, and betrayal. And now, it seemed that someone in that world was sending a message she was meant to deliver, or die trying. But what exactly was the message? And to whom? As Edwards continued to investigate Curtis's ties, the case seemed to lead in a new direction entirely. A connection was made between Curtis Jackson and a mysterious figure in the background of Shante's life, a woman named Lena Turner. Lena was a former friend of Shante's who had grown distant over the years, a woman who had seemed to disappear from Shante's life after the death of Malik. But as Edwards dug deeper into Lena's background, he uncovered a shocking revelation: Lena had been involved with Curtis Jackson for several years, even before Jamal's death. It was then that Edwards made a chilling discovery: Lena was more than just a former friend. She had been involved in Jamal's death. A fact Shante had never known. Lena had been an accomplice to the killing. The story was heart-wrenching in its betrayal. Lena had been the one who had lured Jamal into the trap, orchestrating his murder at the hands of the gang, and had then become an integral part of the very underworld Shante was trying to escape. And now Lena, seeing Shante as a liability, had become a key figure in Shante's murder. The jealousy, the anger, and the raw emotions surrounding this revelation cut deep. Lena had been the one who had wanted to keep Shante in the dark, to shield her from the truth, but she had failed. Shante's pursuit of closure, her desperate search for answers after Malik's death, had exposed everything Lena had hoped to keep buried. But what was Lena's role in the murder itself? Was she the one who had pulled the trigger? Edwards knew that, while Lena had orchestrated Jamal's death, she had always been careful not to get her hands dirty. She had someone else do the dirty work, someone willing to sacrifice their conscience for money. Was this how Shante had met her end? In a desperate attempt to tie everything together, Edwards called in a final round of interviews. This time, he brought in Lena for questioning. Her demeanor was cold, distant, everything about her was calculated. She denied everything, her story consistent with the version of events she had stuck to for years. But something in her eyes, something in the way she avoided direct answers, told Edwards everything he needed to know. Lena knew far more than she was letting on. It wasn't until Edwards showed her the piece of evidence that changed everything, the surveillance footage of the mysterious figure in the hoodie, when her composure cracked. The tattoo on the wrist, she knew. She knew exactly what it was. And it was then that Lena finally admitted the truth. She had been present when Shante was murdered. She had been the one to set it all up. She had contacted Tyrone, a man who once called her friend, to do the job. But as Lena saw it, it wasn't personal. Shante had become a problem, an obstacle standing in the way of the power she wanted to reclaim. Shante's desire to confront the past had become too dangerous. Her questions about Jamal's death, her investigation into who had really killed him, this was the breaking point. Shante had become a loose end that needed to be silenced. But the truth was even darker than anyone could have imagined. Lena hadn't just wanted Shante dead, she had wanted her out of the picture permanently. And as the full scope of the plot came to light, Edwards realized that the murder was far from just an act of vengeance. It was about control, power, and a desire to erase anyone who threatened Lena's place in the dangerous world she had chosen. In the end, Lena Turner was arrested, and the web of lies and deceit that had been woven around Shante Williams' life slowly unraveled. But the impact of the murder rippled through everyone who had been involved: Shante's family, her friends, the people who had loved her. The tragedy of Shante's death would never be fully understood. She had been a woman who had lost so much, tried to rebuild, and fought to protect her daughter from the horrors of her past. But in the end, she had paid the ultimate price for seeking the truth. Detective Edwards stood over the case files, the weight of everything Shante had endured pressing down on him. The case was solved, but the questions remained: would the people involved ever truly pay for the damage they had caused? And for the family left behind, was there even a way to find closure after so much loss? The case of Shante Williams, once a mysterious and heartbreaking murder, had come to a conclusion, but the ripples of her death would echo for a long time. With Lena Turner now in custody, the final pieces of the puzzle were in place, but the emotional and psychological scars left behind were just as deep as they had ever been. The story, though resolved on the surface, was far from over. Detective Edwards knew that, even after the arrests and confessions, this case would haunt him for years to come. The trial of Lena Turner was a spectacle. The courtroom was filled with tension, every observer knowing that this trial was more than just about one woman's actions. It was about the entire underworld of crime, betrayal, and the aftermath of a woman's tragic fate. The defense tried to argue that Lena's role was exaggerated, painting her as a peripheral figure, an accomplice who had merely been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the evidence against her was overwhelming. What became most apparent, though, was the coldness with which Lena had conducted her life. There was no remorse, no recognition of the pain she had caused. Her eyes, always calculating, never wavered as the prosecution laid out the brutal details of Shante's murder. The jury listened in stunned silence as the prosecution described how Lena had set everything in motion, how she had used her connections and her knowledge of Shante's life to exploit her weaknesses. Lena's cold demeanor contrasted sharply with the grief of Shante's family, whose emotions spilled over during the trial. Shante's mother, a woman who had already buried a daughter and a son, sat in the front row, her face a mask of sorrow and disbelief. Her pain was visible to all, as she listened to the details of the final moments of her daughter's life. And then there was Shante's young daughter, a girl too young to understand the full scope of the tragedy, but old enough to know that her mother was never coming back. She would be left to grow up without the woman who had fought so hard to give her a better life. The trial was a grim spectacle, but it was also an opportunity for those who had known Shante to finally find some closure. Some of Shante's friends testified, recounting the moments they had shared with her, the joy and laughter that had come before the darkness had clouded her life. These were the people who had seen her as more than just a mother, more than just a woman tied to a violent past. They had seen her as someone who had been trying to change, to build a future for herself and her daughter. But the story of Shante's life wasn't just one of loss, it was also one of resilience. Despite everything, Shante had never given up. She had fought to escape the life that had entangled her, and in the end, she had tried to protect her daughter from it all. She had been determined to ensure that her child would never have to face the same choices, the same pain, that had marked her own life. And yet, despite all her efforts, Shante had become another victim of a world she had desperately tried to leave behind. As the trial progressed, more information about the people involved in Shante's life emerged. A full investigation into the gang connections, the financial deals, the network of criminals who had once controlled Detroit streets, revealed a much larger picture than anyone had anticipated. Curtis Jackson, Lena's former lover, was arrested for his role in the orchestrated murder, and a dozen other arrests followed as law enforcement unraveled a criminal empire that had operated with impunity for years. But it wasn't just the men involved in the gang that Edwards was concerned with. The role of women in these organizations, women like Lena, was something that the authorities had always overlooked. They were often just as ruthless, just as calculating, and just as dangerous. Lena, for all her charm and her carefully constructed image, had been one of the key players. Her actions had not just destroyed Shante's life, but had torn apart everything Shante had tried to build. For Lena, it had always been about power and control. Edwards knew, as he sat in the quiet of his office late at night, that this case was far from over for him. There would be more questions to answer, more truths to uncover. Even after Lena was sentenced, after the verdict was read and the gavel slammed, Edwards couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something lurking beneath the surface. There were others involved, people who hadn't been caught, people who had never been identified. The world of organized crime, especially in a city like Detroit, didn't just end with one arrest. And then there was the personal toll of the case, the toll it took on him, on those who had worked tirelessly to bring Shante's killer to justice. Detectives, lawyers, and even the court staff all carried a weight after the case concluded. They couldn't help but wonder what they could have done differently, what more they could have uncovered before it was too late. They asked themselves whether there were other victims, other stories like Shante's that would never be told. Shante's death had left an indelible mark on Detroit. The city, with its history of crime, had seen too many lives lost in the same tragic way, but Shante's story was different. She was not just a victim of violence, she was a mother, a sister, a daughter, a woman who had tried, with everything she had, to escape a brutal past. And yet, in the end, the past had come for her, and it had taken her life. As the trial drew to a close, and the last of the suspects were taken off the streets, Detective Edwards stood by the window of his office, looking out over the city. The case had taken everything out of him, every ounce of energy, every bit of focus. But in the end, he knew that the work wasn't done. Not really. There would always be more cases, more tragedies. There would always be more lives to protect. The scars left by Shante's death were deep, and the city of Detroit would forever carry the weight of the corruption, the pain, and the violence that had existed in its streets for far too long. Yet, in the ashes of this tragedy, there was a glimmer of hope, justice had been served, and the city had been forced to reckon with the truth. For Shante Williams, a mother who had been torn apart by the actions of those she trusted, her legacy would live on. Not in the brutality of her death, but in the fact that she had fought for the truth. Her name, her story, would remain in the hearts of those who had known her as more than just a victim. She had been a woman who had sought to protect her child, to fight against the forces that had torn her life apart, and in doing so, she had made a difference. And as the case closed and the courtroom emptied, Edwards couldn't help but think of one thing: Shante had won, even in death. As we close the chapter on this harrowing story, we want to hear from you. Do you think justice was truly served in this case, or are there still pieces of the puzzle left to uncover? What's your theory on the forces that shaped Shante's life and ultimately led to her tragic death? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to dive deeper into more cases like this one, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an update. Like and share this video with friends who need to hear this story, and don't forget to turn on notifications, so you're always the first to know when new content drops. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more gripping true crime cases.